The crew chief's name was Eddie Kowalski, and on the morning of March 15, 1945, he made a decision that should have killed a man. He topped off a P-47 Thunderbolt with fuel he'd siphoned from a wreck everyone else had written off as contaminated. The pilot who took that plane up that day was Second Lieutenant Robert Archer. By nightfall, Archer would limp back to base with 317 documented flak holes in his aircraft, an engine that had no earthly right to be running, and a story that would make Eddie Kowalski question whether stupidity and genius were sometimes the exact same thing. This happened at a forward airfield designated Y-64, carved out of frozen mud 20 miles behind the Rhine. The 362nd Fighter Group had been flying close air support missions since dawn, hitting German armor retreating toward the Ruhr pocket. Every sortie meant maximum ordnance and maximum fuel. There was no margin for error, no wiggle room, no second chances. And that morning, they were running dry. Eddie Kowalski was 23 years old. He'd grown up in Toledo, Ohio, working in his father's garage since he was tall enough to hold a wrench. He knew engines the way a priest knows scripture. Every sound, every vibration, every smell told him a story. When he got to Y-64 in January of '45, he'd been assigned to maintain 4 P-47s. By March, he knew every rivet in those birds. He could diagnose a problem by the pitch of the engine at idle, and he had exactly one rule that he lived by: get them up, get them back. The fuel shortage hit on March 14th. A supply convoy had been hit by artillery outside Remagen. 2 tanker trucks destroyed, 1 damaged but still mobile. That damaged truck limped into Y-64, around 2100 hours, leaking from a puncture in the main tank. The fuel it carried was questionable at best. The driver said it had been sitting in that truck for 6 days, exposed to temperature swings, possibly contaminated by debris from the explosion that had killed the other trucks. The book said you didn't use fuel like that. The book said you waited for clean supply. The book said a lot of things that didn't mean much when you had 12 aircraft and enough fuel for maybe 8 sorties. Eddie watched them pump what they could from that damaged truck into barrels. He watched the ops officer and the CO argue about whether to use it. He watched them decide to wait for the next convoy, due in sometime after dawn. And then he watched the orders come down at 0500 hours on the 15th. Maximum effort, every bird in the air, hit the German armor before it could dig in along the Sieg River. The next convoy hadn't arrived. They had fuel for 8 aircraft. They needed 12. That's when Eddie Kowalski stopped thinking and started moving. He went to the wreck of a P-47 that had bellied in 2 weeks earlier. The pilot had walked away, but the bird was a write-off. 50 cal rounds cooked off, fuselage cracked, landing gear collapsed, but the fuel tanks were intact, and Eddie knew that inside those tanks was at least 80 gallons of high-octane aviation fuel that nobody had bothered to drain because the plane was scheduled to be scrapped for parts whenever someone got around to it. He grabbed a hand pump, a fuel can, and a length of rubber hose. He didn't ask permission because he knew what the answer would be. He climbed up on that wreck in the dark, cracked open the fuel cap, fed the hose down into the tank, and started pumping. The fuel came up smelling sharp, maybe a little off, but it came up. He filled 2 5-gallon cans, then 2 more, then 2 more after that. By the time the sun started to break over the tree line, he had 60 gallons of fuel that hadn't been authorized, hadn't been tested, and hadn't been approved by anyone with a rank higher than Staff Sergeant. Robert Archer showed up for his pre-flight at Euro 615. He was 24 years old, a farm kid from Nebraska who'd learned to fly in a Stearman and soloed in a P-40 before they transitioned him to the Jug. He'd been in theater since November of '44. He'd flown 46 combat missions. He was cautious, methodical, and lucky. The kind of pilot who checked everything twice and didn't cut corners. When he walked up to his assigned aircraft that morning, he found Eddie Kowalski finishing the fueling procedure. Archer asked the question every pilot asks, "She good to go?" Eddie nodded. He didn't mention where the fuel had come from. He didn't mention that he'd violated about 6 different regulations in the last hour. He just said, "Topped off and ready. She'll get you there and back." Archer did his walk around. He checked the control surfaces, the tires, the prop, the guns. Everything looked right. He climbed into the cockpit, strapped in, and started the ignition sequence. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp turned over, coughed once, and then roared to life with that deep, hammering sound that made the P-47 one of the most reassuring aircraft in the European theater. Eddie stood on the wing and gave Archer the thumbs up. Archer returned it, and then he taxied out to join the 11 other Thunderbolts already forming up for takeoff. The mission brief had been simple: fly east to the Sieg River Valley, locate German armor moving northwest toward defensive positions, and destroy. Dive bombing, strafing, anything that would stop and give the ground forces time to encircle the pocket. Expected opposition: light to moderate flak, possible enemy fighters, but unlikely given the Luftwaffe's fuel expected duration, 90 minutes wheels up to wheels down. They took off in 3 flights of 4. Archer was flying number 3 in the second flight. The weather was clear, visibility unlimited, temperature just above freezing. It was the kind of morning that made you believe the war might actually end soon. They climbed to 8,000 feet and headed east. The Rhine slipped beneath them, silver and cold in the early light. Beyond it, Germany stretched out in shades of brown and gray, a landscape that had been bombed and burned and fought over for so long that it barely resembled anything living. They reached the target area at 0700. The spotter aircraft had done its job. A column of German vehicles was strung out along a narrow road, trying to move through a valley where the trees offered some concealment, but not enough. Armor, half-tracks, trucks, all of it bottlenecked at a bridge that had been damaged but not destroyed. It was what they called a target-rich environment, the kind of mission where you went in knowing you'd do damage. The flight leader called the attack. They'd go in one pass at a time, diving from the north, pulling out to the west. Archer's flight went second. He rolled into his dive at 7,000 feet, throttle forward, gun sight centered on a Panther tank near the head of the column. The Flak started before he reached 5,000 feet. That's the thing about German anti-aircraft fire in the final months of the war. It wasn't heavy, but it was accurate. The crews manning those guns knew they were losing. They knew every plane they brought down might buy them one more day. They knew the odds, and they fired anyway. The sky around Archer erupted in black puffs, each one a shell exploding with enough force to shred metal and flesh. He felt the concussions through the airframe, felt the Thunderbolt shudder and buck, but the P-47 was built like a tank. It could take punishment. He stayed on target. He opened up with the .850 caliber machine guns at 3,000 feet. The sound was like tearing canvas, a roar that drowned out even the engine. He watched his tracers walk across the road, across the Panther, across the vehicles behind it. He saw metal spark and smoke bloom, and then he was pulling out, pulling hard, 6 Gs pressing him into the seat, vision narrowing, the world going gray at the edges. He leveled out at 1,500 feet and banked west. That's when the engine coughed. It wasn't a big cough, not a failure, not a seizure, just a momentary interruption in the smooth thunder of the R-2800. But Archer felt it. Every pilot knows that sound. It's the sound of something wrong. He checked his gauges. Oil pressure good, oil temperature good. Cylinder head temperature good, fuel pressure good. Everything was green. But the engine coughed again. He keyed his radio. "Lead! This is Blue 3. I've got a rough engine. Pulling out of the pattern." The flight leader's voice came back, calm and clipped. "Roger. Blue 3. Head for home. We'll cover you." Archer turned southwest, back toward the Rhine, back toward Y-64. The engine smoothed out. Whatever had caused the cough seemed to have resolved itself. Maybe a bit of debris in the fuel line, maybe vapor lock from the dive, maybe nothing at all. He kept climbing, kept the throttle at cruise setting, kept his eyes on the gauges. The river came into sight, and he started to relax. That's when the Flak battery caught him. It was a single gun, maybe an 88, positioned on a hill overlooking the river valley. The crew must have seen him coming, must have tracked him as he climbed, must have waited for the perfect moment. They fired one round. Archer never saw it. He just felt the explosion, felt the Thunderbolt lurch sideways, felt the controls go sloppy in his hands. The cockpit filled with the smell of burning metal and hot oil. He looked down. The right side of the fuselage was shredded. He could see daylight through holes the size of his fist. The right wing had taken damage too, the aileron torn, fabric flapping in the slipstream. But the engine was still running. The gauges were still green. He still had control. He nursed the throttle, kept the wings level, and kept flying. The radio was dead. He tried to call back to base, got nothing but static. He tried to call the flight, got the same. Either the radio was hit or the antenna was gone. It didn't matter. He was alone. He had 25 miles to cover, an airplane that was barely holding together, and an engine that had coughed twice already. All he could do was fly. The engine coughed again at 10 miles out. This time it was worse. The RPM dropped, the nose dipped, and for 3 seconds that felt like 3 hours. Archer thought he was going into the trees. Then the engine caught, surged, steadied. He didn't know what was keeping it running. He didn't know what was keeping the wings attached. He just knew he wasn't dead yet. He saw Y-64 at 8 miles. He dropped to 500 feet, lined up on the runway, and started his approach. The tower must have seen him because the crash trucks were already rolling. He could see them racing along the perimeter road, could see the crews scrambling. He dropped his landing gear. 2 green lights. Miracle number 1. He dropped his flaps. They deployed. ragged but functional. Miracle number 2. The engine was running rough now, a grinding, clattering sound that meant something inside was coming apart. He cut his airspeed as much as he dared, fought the crosswind, fought the damaged controls, fought the airplane every foot of the way down. His wheels touched concrete at 90 miles an hour. He stood on the brakes. The Thunderbolt shuddered, slewed left, straightened out, and then he was rolling, the end of the runway coming up fast. He killed the engine. The prop windmilled to a stop. The P-47 coasted the last 100 feet and stopped with 20 yards of runway to spare. Archer sat there for a long moment, hands still on the stick, breath coming hard. Then he popped the canopy, unbuckled, and climbed out. The crash crew was already swarming the aircraft. Eddie Kowalski was sprinting across the tarmac. Eddie reached the plane and stopped. He just stood there, staring. The P-47 looked like it had flown through a metal shredder. Holes everywhere. Fuselage, wings, tail, cowling. Some of them small, some of them big enough to fit your head through. Eddie counted them later, after the aircraft had been towed to the maintenance area, after the photo reconnaissance boys had documented the damage for the records. 317 holes, some from the 88 round, most from shrapnel and secondary fragmentation. The right wing spar was cracked, the hydraulic lines were severed, the radio was destroyed, the tail assembly was held on by 4 bolts and a prayer, but the engine had kept running. That big, beautiful, stupid R-2800 had taken shrapnel through the oil cooler, through the accessory case, through the supercharger housing, and it had kept running. Eddie pulled the cowling and looked inside. He found metal fragments embedded in the crankcase. He found a severed fuel line that should have drained the tank in 30 seconds. He found damage that should have seized the engine at altitude and turned Archer into a glider with nowhere to glide. And then he checked the fuel. He drained the remaining fuel from the tanks and ran it through a filter. It came out cloudy, contaminated, exactly what the book said would destroy an engine, exactly what he'd pumped out of that wrecked P-47 in the dark that morning. Archer walked over, while Eddie was staring at the fuel sample. He looked at the crew chief, looked at the airplane, looked back at Eddie. "What did you put in my bird?" Eddie didn't answer right away. He was running the numbers in his head, trying to figure out how this made sense. The fuel was bad. The fuel should have caused detonation, pre-ignition, valve damage, a dozen different failures that would have left Archer dead in a field somewhere east of the Rhine. But the engine had run. It had run rough, it had coughed, it had complained, but it had run. And then he understood. The contamination in the fuel had actually lowered the octane rating. Not by much, but enough. And when the flak had hit, when the shrapnel had torn through the engine, when the temperatures had spiked and the pressures had fluctuated, that lower octane fuel had been more forgiving. It hadn't detonated under stress the way clean, high-octane fuel might have. It had burned dirty, burned rough, but it had burned steady. The fuel that should have killed the engine had saved it. Eddie looked at Archer and said the only thing that made sense. "I have no idea." The story didn't stay quiet. It couldn't. An aircraft doesn't come back with 317 holes and an engine that shouldn't be running without people asking questions. The CO wanted to know where the fuel had come from. The ops officer wanted to know why regulations had been violated. The maintenance chief wanted to know who'd authorized the use of unverified fuel. And Eddie Kowalski stood in front of all of them and told the truth. He'd made a choice. He'd broken the rules. He'd put a pilot in the air with fuel that hadn't been tested, and that pilot had lived. They could have court-martialed him. They could have busted him down to private and stuck him in a labor battalion. But Robert Archer stood up in that meeting and said 7 words that ended the conversation. "He's the reason I'm still here." The CO looked at Eddie for a long time. Then he said, "Don't do it again." And that was the end of it. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The P-47 was scrapped. There was no saving it. The airframe had been stressed beyond limits. The wing spar was compromised, and even if they'd had the parts and the time, it would never be safe to fly again. They stripped it for salvage and pushed what was left into the boneyard at the edge of the field. Eddie went out there a few days later and stood looking at it. He'd kept that plane flying for 3 months. He'd patched bullet holes, replaced spark plugs, adjusted trim tabs, bled hydraulic lines. He'd known every sound it made, every quirk, every temperament. And now it was junk. Archer found him there. He didn't say anything at first, just stood next to Eddie and looked at the wreck. Then he pulled something out of his pocket and handed it over. It was a piece of shrapnel, jagged and sharp, about the size of a silver dollar. "Found this in the cockpit," Archer said. "It was sitting on the seat next to me when I landed. I didn't even know it was there." Eddie turned it over in his hands. It was a chunk of an 88mm shell casing, torn and twisted from the explosion. If it had hit Archer instead of the seat, the mission would have ended very differently. If it had hit the control cables, same thing. If it had hit any one of 1,000 critical components, same thing. But it hadn't. It had punched through the fuselage, spent its energy, and come to rest on the seat. One more piece of luck in a day that had been built on nothing but. "You keep that," Archer said. "Remind yourself that sometimes stupid works." Eddie kept it. He carried it in his pocket for the rest of the war, and then he carried it home to Toledo when the fighting ended in May. He went back to working in his father's garage, married a girl named Dorothy, had 3 kids, and never talked much about what he'd done in the war. But he kept that piece of shrapnel in a drawer in his workshop, and every now and then, he'd take it out and think about a morning in March when he'd made a decision that defied every rule he'd been taught. Robert Archer flew 22 more missions before VE Day. He survived the war, went back to Nebraska, and ran a farm equipment business for 40 years. He and Eddie stayed in touch. Letters at first, then phone calls, then visits when they could manage it. They'd sit on Eddie's porch or Robert's porch and talk about things that had nothing to do with the war. But every now and then, one of them would mention that day, and they'd both go quiet, remembering what it felt like to live through something that shouldn't have been survivable. The 372nd Fighter Group was deactivated in August of 1946. The men scattered, went home, tried to build lives that made sense after what they'd seen. Some succeeded, some didn't. The ones who stayed in touch would gather every few years, drink too much, tell stories, and pretend they weren't getting old. Eddie and Robert went to a few of those reunions. They'd listen to the other guys talk about missions and close calls and the friends who didn't make it back. And they'd think about fuel and flak and the thin line between genius and stupidity. Eddie Kowalski died in 1989. Heart attack, quick and quiet, in his sleep. Robert Archer spoke at the funeral. He told the story about the fuel, about the 317 holes, about the engine that refused to quit. He told it the way it happened, without embellishment, without exaggeration. And when he finished, he said something that Eddie had never been able to say out loud. "He saved my life by breaking the rules, and I never got to thank him enough for that." Robert died in 1997. His kids found the piece of shrapnel in a box of his personal effects, wrapped in a letter from Eddie that had been written in 1985. The letter said, "You asked me once why I did it, why I used that fuel when I knew it was wrong. The truth is, I didn't think about it. I just knew we needed 12 planes in the air and we only had fuel for 8. I knew you were a good pilot, and you deserved a chance to fly. I knew the mission mattered, and I knew that sometimes you have to trust your gut even when your brain is telling you you're an idiot. I've spent 40 years wondering if I made the right call, but you're still here, so I guess I did." The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. The 392nd Fighter Group flew its last combat mission on May 7th. In the 53 days between Eddie's decision and the end of the war, the group flew over 1,000 sorties, destroyed hundreds of vehicles and artillery pieces, and lost 9 aircraft. None of those losses were due to fuel contamination. None of those losses were due to a crew chief cutting corners. They were due to flak and fighters and bad luck, and the simple arithmetic of war. You fly long enough, your number comes up. But on March 15, 1945, Robert Archer's number didn't come up. He flew into hell, took 317 hits, and came home on an engine that ran on bad fuel and stubbornness. And the man who made that possible was a 23-year-old crew chief from Toledo who understood that war doesn't care about the book. It cares about results. Eddie Kowalski never got a medal for what he did, never got a commendation, never got his name in the unit history. He got a verbal warning from his CO and a reputation among the other mechanics as the guy who'd do whatever it took to get the job done. And that was enough, because in the end, it wasn't about recognition. It wasn't about glory. It was about the fact that a pilot climbed into a plane that morning and climbed out of it that evening. That's the only metric that mattered. The story might have ended there, lost to time like so many other small moments of ingenuity and desperation that happened in the chaos of war. But in 1983, a historian researching the 362nd Fighter Group came across a maintenance log entry dated March 15, 1945. It was a single line, written in pencil, barely legible. AC-16 refueled from salvage stock. Engine ran rough but completed mission. Recommend investigation of fuel quality. The historian traced that entry back to Eddie Kowalski, found him in Toledo, and asked him about it. Eddie told the story. The historian published it in a small journal that nobody read. And then, years later, that journal ended up in the hands of an Air Force engineer who was studying engine performance under combat stress. The The engineer read about the contaminated fuel and the damaged engine and the 317 flak holes, and he started running simulations. He wanted to know if Eddie's theory was right. He wanted to know if bad fuel could actually save an engine under the right circumstances. The simulations confirmed it. Under normal conditions, contaminated fuel would destroy an engine. But under extreme stress, when temperatures and pressures were already out of spec, lower octane fuel could prevent detonation and pre-ignition. It was a narrow window, a specific set of conditions that had to align perfectly, but it was possible. Eddie Kowalski had stumbled onto a principle of thermodynamics that engineers wouldn't fully understand for another 40 years. He'd done it by instinct, by experience, by trusting his gut when the book told him he was wrong. The engineer tried to track Eddie down to tell him, but by then, Eddie was gone. So he wrote to Robert Archer instead. Robert was in his 70s by then, living in a retirement home in Lincoln, Nebraska. He read the letter, read the technical analysis, read the confirmation that what had happened that day wasn't just luck. It was physics. It was chemistry. It was the universe bending just enough to let two men live, Robert wrote back. He thanked the engineer for the information, and then he said something that the engineer kept on his desk for the rest of his career. Eddie would have laughed at all this. He didn't care about the science. He cared about getting me home. And that's all that ever mattered. The P-47 Thunderbolt was one of the most durable aircraft ever built. It could take damage that would obliterate a lighter fighter and still bring its pilot home. The stories of Jugs limping back to base with entire cylinders shot away, with wings half shredded, with tail sections held on by cables, and hope are legendary. But even among those stories, the tale of Aircraft 16 on March 15, 1945 stands out because it wasn't just the airframe that saved Robert Archer. It was the fuel, the bad, contaminated, unauthorized fuel that a crew chief had pumped out of a wreck in the dark because he knew that sometimes the rules don't matter as much as the mission. There's a photograph of Eddie Kowalski and Robert Archer taken at a reunion in 1978. They're standing in front of a restored P-47, both of them older, grayer, softer around the edges than they were in 1945. Eddie's got his arm around Robert's shoulder. Robert's smiling. Eddie's not. He's looking at the camera with the same expression he wore that morning when Archer asked if the plane was good to go. It's the expression of a man who knows what he risked, what he gambled, and what he won. It's the expression of a man who broke the rules and got away with it because the alternative was unacceptable. That photograph is in a museum now, part of an exhibit on ground crews and the unsung heroes who kept the aircraft flying. There's a placard next to it that tells the story in sanitized official language. It talks about resourcefulness and ingenuity and the challenges of maintaining aircraft in a combat zone. It doesn't mention that Eddie violated 6 regulations. It doesn't mention that he could have been court-martialed. It doesn't mention that he made a choice in the dark, alone, that saved a man's life. Because that's not the kind of thing you put on a placard. But the men who served know. The mechanics who kept the birds flying know. The pilots who trusted those mechanics with their lives know. They know that war isn't won by following the book. It's won by people who understand when the book needs to be thrown out the window. It's won by crew chiefs like Eddie Kowalski, who looked at a wrecked airplane and saw 60 gallons of possibility, who looked at a fuel shortage and saw a problem to solve, who looked at the risks and decided that getting 12 planes in the air mattered more than his career. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The war changed everyone who fought in it. Some came home broken, some came home angry, some came home and pretended nothing had happened. Eddie Kowalski came home and went back to work. He didn't talk about what he'd done. He didn't seek recognition. He just fixed cars and raised his kids and tried to forget the sound of aircraft engines starting up in the dark. But he never forgot the weight of responsibility. He never forgot what it felt like to know that a man's life depended on the choices he made. And he never forgot that morning in March when he decided that stupid was better than sorry. Robert Archer came home and farmed. He planted crops and raised cattle and watched the seasons turn. He didn't talk about the war much either, but every March 15th he'd think about a crew chief in Toledo. He'd think about an engine that shouldn't have run. He'd think about 317 holes and a piece of shrapnel that landed on the seat instead of in his chest. And he'd be grateful, not for the war, not for the mission, but for the fact that someone had cared enough to break the rules. There's a lesson in this story, though neither Eddie nor Robert would have called it that. The lesson is that sometimes the right thing to do is the wrong thing to do. Sometimes the rules exist to keep you safe, and sometimes they exist to be broken when safety isn't the priority. Sometimes you have to trust the guy next to you, the guy who knows engines or knows tactics or knows the terrain, even when what he's doing seems insane. Because war is insane. Combat is insane. And the only way to survive insanity is to match it with a kind of calculated recklessness that looks like stupidity from the outside, but feels like necessity from the inside. Eddie Kowalski was not a hero in the traditional sense. He didn't charge a machine gun nest. He didn't pull a wounded man from a burning tank. He didn't throw himself on a grenade. What he did was quieter, less dramatic, and just as important. He made a decision in the dark that gave a pilot a chance. And that pilot took that chance and came home. That's the kind of heroism that doesn't make headlines. That's the kind of heroism that gets written in pencil in a maintenance log and forgotten for 40 years. But it's heroism nonetheless. The men who fought in World War II are almost gone now. The last veterans are in their 90s, and every day there are fewer of them. The stories they carried, the memories they held, the lessons they learned are slipping away. And with them goes a kind of knowledge that can't be taught in schools or found in books. It's the knowledge of what it means to look at an impossible situation and find a way through. It's the knowledge of what it means to trust your gut when your brain is screaming at you to stop. It's the knowledge of what it means to care more about the mission than the consequences. Eddie Kowalski and Robert Archer are both gone. The 362nd Fighter Group is a footnote in history. The airfield at Y-64 is farmland now, reclaimed by the same earth that was churned into mud by the boots and tires and treads of an army that swept across Europe in the final months of the war. The P-47 Thunderbolt is a museum piece, a relic of a time when aircraft were built like tanks and flown by men who believed they were invincible. And the story of a crew chief who used bad fuel to save a pilot's life is known by maybe a few hundred people who stumble across it in obscure journals or hear it from a grandfather who remembers. But the story matters. It matters because it's true. It matters because it's about the kind of courage that doesn't look like courage until you understand the stakes. It matters because it's about two men who did their jobs under impossible circumstances and lived to tell about it. And it matters because it reminds us that sometimes the difference between life and death is a decision made in the dark by someone who cares enough to take the risk. On March 15, 1945, Eddie Kowalski broke the rules. He used fuel that he knew was questionable. He put a pilot in the air without authorization. He gambled with a man's life. And Robert Archer flew into a wall of flak, took 317 hits, and came home on an engine that ran on contamination and willpower. It shouldn't have worked. By every measure of logic and regulation and common sense, it should have ended in disaster. But it didn't. Because sometimes in the chaos of war, stupid and genius are the same thing. And sometimes the man who's willing to bet on stupid is the one who saves a life. That's the story. That's what happened. And that's why we remember. The thing about war stories is that they never really end when the shooting stops. They echo forward through decades, through generations, through the lives of people who weren't even born when the events took place. The story of Eddie Kowalski and Robert Archer echoed through the lives of their children, their grandchildren, and eventually through the life of a young Air Force captain named Michael Brennan, who heard it in 2003 while deployed to Iraq. Brennan was a maintenance officer at Balad Air Base, responsible for keeping A-10 Warthogs operational in a combat environment where sand, heat, and constant use were grinding down aircraft faster than parts could be shipped in. He was facing a problem that Eddie Kowalski would have understood immediately. He had 12 aircraft and enough certified hydraulic fluid for 8. A resupply flight had been delayed by a sandstorm. The next mission was scheduled for dawn, and the book said, "You didn't fly without proper fluids." Brennan had read about Eddie Kowalski in a technical journal during his training. The story had stuck with him, not because it was about breaking rules, but because it was about understanding systems well enough to know when the rules didn't apply. He spent that night in the maintenance hangar, running tests on hydraulic fluid that had been sitting in storage for 18 months, past its rated shelf life. The test came back marginal. Not great, not terrible, just marginal, and Brennan made a choice that Eddie would have recognized. He used it. All 12 A-10s flew the next morning. All 12 came back. And when the resupply flight finally arrived 2 days later, Brennan filed a report that detailed exactly what he'd done and why. He expected consequences. What he got was a quiet conversation with his commanding officer who told him about a crew chief in World War II who'd done something similar with fuel. The CO had heard the story from his father, who'd served with the 362nd Fighter Group. Small world, small Air Force, long memory. That's how these stories survive. Not through official channels or formal documentation, but through word of mouth, through one generation of maintainers passing knowledge to the next, through the understanding that sometimes the mission requires you to trust your training and your instincts more than you trust the manual. Eddie Kowalski never knew that his decision on March 15, 1945 would influence maintenance doctrine 60 years later. But it did, because the lesson wasn't about fuel contamination. The lesson was about calculated risk and understanding your equipment well enough to know its limits. Robert Archer's son, David, grew up hearing fragments of the story. His father would mention it sometimes, usually after a few beers at a family gathering, usually when someone asked him about the war. David heard about the flak holes and the rough engine and the crew chief who'd done something crazy. But it wasn't until his father's funeral in 1997 that he understood the weight of it. He found the piece of shrapnel and Eddie's letter, and he realized that his entire existence was predicated on a decision made by a man he'd never met. If Eddie had played it safe, if he'd waited for authorized fuel, Robert Archer wouldn't have flown that day, and David wouldn't have been born. That kind of realization changes you. David started researching the story, reaching out to surviving members of the 362nd Fighter Group, tracking down maintenance records, trying to piece together exactly what had happened. He found Eddie's daughter, Carol, living in Cleveland. He called her, introduced himself, and told her what her father had done. She'd known her father had been a mechanic during the war, but Eddie had never talked about it in detail. The story David told her was a revelation. Carol invited David to visit. He drove up to Cleveland in the fall of 1998, brought the piece of shrapnel and the letter, and spent an afternoon sitting in Carol's living room, looking at photographs of Eddie Kowalski. There was Eddie in uniform, young and serious, standing in front of a P-47. There was Eddie with his crew, all of them squinting in the sun, all of them looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. There was Eddie after the war, older, softer, standing in front of his garage with grease on his hands and a slight smile on his face. Carol talked about her father the way children talk about parents they loved but never fully understood. She said he was quiet, steady, the kind of man who fixed things without complaining. She said he worked long hours and never missed a Little League game. She said he had nightmares sometimes, even decades after the war. Nightmares that would wake him in the middle of the night. He never talked about what he dreamed, but Carol suspected it had something to do with aircraft and decisions and the weight of other men's lives. David and Carol stayed in touch. They'd talk on the phone every few months, sharing stories about their fathers, trying to understand the connection between two men who'd been thrown together by war and circumstance. In 2004, they decided to visit Y-64 together. The airfield was long gone, plowed under and returned to farmland, but the location was documented. They flew to Germany, rented a car, and drove to a spot in the countryside where, 60 years earlier, men had lived and fought and made decisions that still mattered. They stood in a field that had once been a runway. The ground was soft, muddy from recent rain, planted with winter wheat that was just starting to come up. There was nothing to indicate that this had been a place of war. No markers, no monuments, no signs, just farmland stretching to the horizon under a gray November sky. But David and Carol stood there and imagined it. The tents, the aircraft, the men moving through the cold morning darkness, the sound of engines starting, the smell of exhaust and oil and burned powder, the tension before every mission, the relief after every return. Carol cried, not because of what had happened, but because of what might have happened, because she understood, standing there in that field, that her father's decision had rippled forward through time in ways he could never have anticipated. Her father had given Robert Archer a chance to live, and that chance had cascaded into David's existence, into the existence of David's children, into futures that wouldn't have happened if Eddie Kowalski had played it safe that morning. They found a small stone in the field, weathered and smooth, and Carol put it in her pocket. She carried it back to Cleveland and placed it on her father's grave with a note that said simply, "He came home. Thank you." It's still there, that stone, sitting at the base of Eddie Kowalski's headstone in a cemetery outside Toledo. People walk past it without knowing what it means, but it means everything. The story found its way onto the internet in 2007 when a military history blogger stumbled across the maintenance log entry and the historian's article from 1983. The blogger wrote about it, and suddenly, the story was being shared across forums and social media platforms. Veterans chimed in with their own stories of mechanics who'd bent the rules to keep aircraft flying. Active duty maintainers talked about the pressure of combat logistics and the impossible choices that came with insufficient resources. And slowly, Eddie Kowalski's name began to be spoken in the same breath as other unsung heroes of the ground crew. The Air Force took notice. In 2009, they added a section to their maintenance training curriculum that discussed the balance between regulation compliance and mission requirements. They used Eddie's story as a case study, not to encourage rule-breaking, but to emphasize the importance of understanding systems deeply enough to make informed decisions under pressure. The instructors who taught that section would tell the story of the contaminated fuel and the 317 Flak holes. And then, they'd ask the students a question that had no easy answer. What would you have done? Some students said they'd have followed the rules. Some said they'd have taken the risk. Most admitted they didn't know. And that was the point. Because the answer wasn't about right or wrong. The answer was about understanding the stakes, understanding the equipment, and understanding yourself well enough to know whether you could live with the consequences of your choice. Eddie Kowalski had understood all three. That's what made him exceptional. Robert Archer's grandson Tom enlisted in the Air Force in 2011. He became a pilot flying C-130s in Afghanistan and Iraq. He'd grown up hearing the story from his father, and it had influenced his decision to serve. He wanted to understand what his grandfather had experienced. He wanted to feel the weight of responsibility that came with climbing into an aircraft that other men had prepared for you. He wanted to know what it meant to trust the ground crew with your life. Tom met Eddie Kowalski's grandson, James, at an air show in Dayton in 2015. James had become a mechanical engineer, working for a defense contractor that designed hydraulic systems for military aircraft. They recognized each other's names from the story, from the articles and blog posts and forum discussions that had kept their grandfather's legacy alive. They talked for hours that day, two men in their 30s connected by something that had happened 70 years earlier. James told Tom about finding his grandfather's toolbox in his grandmother's garage after she passed away. Inside the toolbox was a piece of paper, folded and yellowed, with notes written in Eddie's handwriting. The notes were calculations, fuel-to-air ratios, octane ratings, temperature tolerances. Eddie had been trying to understand what had happened that day. He'd been trying to figure out why the bad fuel had worked. He'd never found a complete answer, but he'd kept trying, kept calculating, kept searching for the logic in something that had felt like luck. Tom told James about flying into Bagram on a C-130 that had been patched and repaired so many times that the crew joked it was held together by speed tape and prayers. He told him about trusting the maintainers who signed off on that aircraft, about climbing into the cockpit knowing that someone he'd never met had bet their career on the belief that the plane was safe to fly. He told him about understanding, for the first time, what his grandfather must have felt climbing into that P-47 on March 15, 1945. They stayed in touch. They'd meet up once a year, usually at an air show or a military reunion, and they'd talk about their grandfathers and the invisible thread that connected their families. In 2018, they decided to do something that neither Eddie nor Robert had lived to see. They tracked down the wreckage of the P-47. It wasn't easy. The aircraft had been scrapped in 1945, pushed into a boneyard at Y-64, and eventually buried when the field was decommissioned. But James was an engineer and Tom was a pilot, and between the two of them, they had access to historical records, salvage logs, and ground-penetrating radar technology. They spent 6 months researching, planning, and coordinating with German authorities, and in October of 2018, they stood in a field outside what had been Y-64 and watched an excavation crew dig into the earth. They found pieces, fragments of aluminum, sections of the fuselage, a landing gear strut, and incredibly, impossibly, part of the engine. The R-2800 had been buried under 6 feet of earth for 73 years, but it was still recognizable. The crankcase was there, corroded but intact. The cylinders were there, frozen and cracked, and embedded in the metal. Visible even through the rust and decay were the scars of shrapnel from March 15, 1945. James and Tom had the engine excavated and transported to a restoration facility in Munich. They paid for it themselves, both of them contributing thousands of dollars to preserve something that most people would consider junk. But it wasn't junk to them. It was proof. It was evidence of a day when everything went wrong and somehow went right. It was a testament to the fact that sometimes, against all odds, stupid works. The restored engine is on display now at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. It sits in a glass case with a placard that tells the story of Eddie Kowalski and Robert Archer. The placard is more honest than the one from 1978. It talks about the contaminated fuel and the violated regulations and the impossible choice. It talks about the 317 flak holes and the engine that refused to quit. And it ends with a quote from Eddie's letter. Sometimes you have to trust your gut, even when your brain is telling you you're an idiot. Visitors to the museum walk past that engine every day. Most of them glance at it, read the placard, and move on. But some of them stop. Some of them stand there for a long time, looking at the scarred metal and the embedded shrapnel, thinking about what it must have been like, thinking about the crew chief in the dark, making a choice that could have ended his career, thinking about the pilot in the cockpit, trusting that choice with his life, thinking about the moment when the engine coughed at altitude and both men realized they were betting everything on a decision that couldn't be undone. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The legacy of that day extends beyond the individuals involved. It extends into the culture of military aviation, into the unspoken understanding between pilots and maintainers, into the recognition that war doesn't happen in neat categories of right and wrong. It happens in the gray spaces where good people make hard choices with incomplete information and hope like hell they made the right call. Eddie Kowalski made the right call. He didn't know it at the time. He spent the rest of his life second-guessing himself, wondering if he'd gotten lucky or if he'd known something that he couldn't articulate, but he made the right call. And Robert Archer lived, and that's all that matters in the end. The story continues to spread. It's been featured in documentaries, podcasts, and history books. It's been taught in military academies and technical schools. It's been used as an example of leadership, of initiative, of the kind of judgment that can't be taught but must be learned through experience. And every time someone tells a story, they add to the legacy of two men who never sought recognition but earned it anyway. In 2023, the Air Force established an award for maintenance personnel who demonstrate exceptional judgment and initiative in support of combat operations. It's called the Kowalski Award. It's not given often, maybe once or twice a year, but when it is given, it goes to someone who understood that sometimes the mission requires you to color outside the lines. The award comes with a replica of that piece of shrapnel, the one Robert Archer carried for 50 years, the one that reminds everyone who sees it that war is random and chaotic, and sometimes you survive for reasons you'll never fully understand. Eddie Kowalski would have hated the attention. He would have said he was just doing his job. He would have deflected credit and pointed to the other mechanics who worked just as hard, who made similar choices, who kept the aircraft flying through mud and cold and exhaustion. He would have said that any crew chief worth his salt would have done the same thing, and maybe he would have been right, but he's the one who did it. He's the one who made the choice, and that makes all the difference. The final word belongs to Robert Archer, from a letter he wrote to Eddie in 1986. I've thought about that day more times than I can count. I've thought about the fuel and the flak and the engine that shouldn't have run. I've thought about what would have happened if you'd played it safe. And I've realized something. You didn't save my life that day. You gave me a chance to save my own life. You put me in the air when everyone else said it couldn't be done, and I brought myself home. That's what good crew chiefs do. They give their pilots a fighting chance. Everything else is up to us. Thank you for the chance, Eddie. I've tried to make it count. He did make it count. 52 years of life after March 15, 1945. A wife, 3 children, 7 grandchildren, a farm, a business, a legacy. All of it built on the foundation of a decision made by a crew chief who broke the rules because the rules didn't account for reality. All of it possible because Eddie Kowalski understood that sometimes you measure success not by what the book says, but by who comes home at the end of the day. That's the story. That's the truth. And that's why these memories matter, because they're not just about war. They're about people. They're about choices. They're about the moments when ordinary individuals are forced to become extraordinary simply because the situation demands it. Eddie Kowalski was ordinary. Robert Archer was ordinary. They were just 2 men trying to do their jobs in impossible circumstances. And in doing those jobs, they created something that transcended the war, transcended their own lives, and became part of the enduring legacy of the men and women who served. The P-47 Thunderbolt, aircraft number 16, took off from Y-64 on the morning of March 15, 1945, running on contaminated fuel and the determination of a crew chief who refused to accept that 12 missions required 13 aircraft. It flew into hell, took 317 hits from German anti-aircraft fire, and came home on an engine that had no right to be running. And in doing so, it proved something that every maintainer and every pilot knows in their bones, that sometimes the only thing standing between life and death is someone who cares enough to take the risk. Remember that. Remember Eddie Kowalski. Remember Robert Archer. Remember that freedom isn't free, and someone always pays the price.